What is a fuel cell and what do you need one for your race car or more specifically drift car? Lots of people install a plastic or aluminum fuel tank like this one and they call it a fuel cell, but is that really what it is? I mean, what makes this any different than just like a regular gas tank? Nothing really. This is something that gets confusing because if you try to search for fuel cell, you'll see all kinds of different products and different ranges, and you also get stuff like hydrogen fuel cell. But all the different products that you find, they're not created equal. Like the aluminum box there, I ran that in my car for several years and probably spent over $3,000 on maintenance, repairs, upgrades to get it to perform as good as a stock tank for my car. So what separates out all these different fuel cells and fuel boxes from fuel tanks? I'm hoping I can help you understand that. While there isn't necessarily like a formal definition for a fuel cell versus fuel tank, I'm gonna give you a better way to differentiate between them and a few of the specific features you should look for if you're looking for a legit fuel cell. A fuel container that provides no additional safety benefit over the factory fuel tank is just another fuel tank. Sometimes these cheap fuel tanks or aluminum boxes like that one was, they come with an anti-slosh foam, but it isn't exactly what you'd consider a safety feature because it's oftentimes cheap, breaks down really fast, and ends up plugging up your filters and your pump. Now, an actual fuel cell is comprised of three components: an outer can, usually constructed from aluminum or steel, a bladder, and proper anti-slosh foam. And that's what you see on this fuel cell. You've got the outer can made of aluminum. The green here, that's the bladder, and then the yellow, that's the proper anti-slosh foam. That bladder is probably one of the most important things because when it comes down to fuel cells, there aren't necessarily any ratings or certifications for the fuel cell, except for it needs to have those things, as well as the bladder itself has to be certified by the FIA or SFI. It has to be certified for safety. Now, different race sanctioning bodies require different levels of certification. There are several within there. So if you're looking into these and you're checking the specific safety certifications, well, you probably already know a thing or two. The aluminum can or the steel can on the outside, that sometimes can have a requirement, but it's just a matter of thickness. I want to break down a little bit more as to why this type of fuel cell is actually way more beneficial than the aluminum can, and talk about why this is what I'm running in my car. First, the outer shell provides protection from impact damage and debris. It's the first line of defense to prevent a fire or explosion. The bladder holds the fuel and prevents it from spilling. It needs to be resistant to impacts and punctures and tears, but it also needs to be flexible enough so it doesn't crack or tear. And the foam, well, it does more than just prevent sloshing. It also absorbs the fuel like a sponge. It prevents fuel vapor from building up in the fuel cell, which is usually the main ignition point for an explosion or a thermal event. When it comes to just like the aluminum can fuel cell, well, it's just an aluminum box. And aluminum work hardens. So over time, the aluminum will crack if you don't have it mounted properly. I've seen several cars leak from these fuel cells and catch fire from these fuel cells because they just don't have the right amount of safety. If you're looking to purchase a fuel cell for your drift car or any race car, this is what I would look at. This one here in particular is a Radium 10-gallon fuel cell. It's got aluminum outer can construction, so it's lightweight. This specific setup here also is Radium's fuel cell mounting cage, and it has these nice fancy straps. And one of the biggest benefits is that you can also get these with Radium's fuel cell surge tank, and that's what normally goes right here. The FCST is probably one of my favorite features from Radium. This right here is Radium's FCST. This is the whole kit and caboodle. A surge tank is an additional safety and performance feature that some people overlook. So the way surge tanks work is they use a lift pump, which pulls fuel from the fuel cell, or if you're using a stock fuel tank, from the fuel tank and puts it into the surge tank. Now, inside of the surge tank, there's another fuel pump, at least one, which then feeds fuel from the surge tank to the rail, to the injectors, and that feeds the engine fuel. Then, from your return, from your fuel pressure regulator, it goes back into the surge tank to make sure it's always full, and then it'll overflow back into the tank or the fuel cell. The reason for all of this complexity and all these extra pumps is that it prevents fuel aeration or fuel starvation. When you're drifting, the G-forces can slosh the fuel from side to side, forward, back, and everything in between. So if you start to run low on fuel without a surge tank, the fuel can slosh away from the fuel pump pickup, which then causes aeration or starvation, which unfortunately can lead to catastrophic consequences. Over the decade I've been drifting, I've seen plenty of cars suffer from this problem, and unfortunately many times it results in a crash. Now the Radium FCST also has a couple of additional bonus features too. So for this, I've got multiple fuel feed pumps in the surge tank. Now my car only makes 250 horsepower, so I don't need the extra volume of 2 fuel pumps, so I only run 1 fuel pump at a time. However, if I have a fuel pump that dies for whatever reason, I can just swap the wires over from one feed pump to the next one, have the second one kick on, and there we go, I've got fuel again. Now, I will say that having a fuel pump die on you is less of a problem with a fuel cell like this and with Radium's FCST than it is with like the aluminum can. Most of these aluminum can fuel cells are usually set up to use an inline pump because your pickup is right here, or sometimes you'll get a pickup that's on top of the tank, but it's not meant to have a pump inside of it. And inline pumps are noisy. They're super loud and they aren't cooled by the fuel, so they end up getting really toasty, especially when you're trying to hot lap. And I love hot lapping. I killed dozens of inline pumps with this fuel cell from heat. There are also filtration problems, mounting issues, all kinds of different stuff that just ended up killing these pumps. It was so frustrating. So if you can use an in-tank pump, you 100,000% should. One of the other things with using an inline pump is that when you aerate, when you lose fuel and it pulls in air, that also causes the pump to get hot. It's not having the fuel going through it. It's just a recipe for disaster. Now there are surge tanks that do mount external of a fuel cell or fuel tank, and they work well to prevent aeration to the rail. But once again, you're still using an inline pump for something like this. I think the thing that bothered me the most about inline pumps, more than, you know, this is really dumb, but more than just spending the money to replace them, was the noise. I hate the noise. It's unnecessary. Inline pumps are just absolutely ridiculously loud, whereas when you're just using an in-tank pump, they are so much quieter. I like to hot lap when I'm at drift events. I like to get as much seat time as possible. So my fuel pumps have gotten pretty hot, and I've cooked quite a few of them at the track with my old setup. Having the surge tank like this mounted inside of the fuel cell is great because all the fuel pumps use regular, you know, this is just a Walbro 255. These are regular in-tank pumps. You know, you can get a replacement for these from the auto part store. You don't need a special order or anything in, like sometimes you have to do with an inline pump. And because they're mounted in tank, they are cooled by sitting in the fuel, meaning that your fuel pumps don't get hot as often or don't get too hot, which means you're not gonna cook your pumps. So the pumps are gonna last longer in a setup like this. And an added bonus of having the surge tank mount inside of the fuel cell or fuel tank, if you're like a grassroots guy or a hobbyist or somebody who still street drives their drift or track car for occasional street use, right? This means that you won't have a surge tank taking up precious space inside of your trunk. So you've got more space for wheels, tires, parts, tools, whatever back there. So the surge tank prevents aeration, and the Radium setup, specifically with their Radium fuel cell, mounts the surge tank and the feed pump and everything inside of the tank so you don't run into fuel pump failures, and it keeps everything nice and quiet. In-tank pumps are quiet already when compared to inline pumps, and putting it inside of a tank where you've got, you know, foam in here, you've got a bladder and then another case. I mean, it keeps everything way quieter, which is just a huge bonus for me. I like a quiet system. So all these combined are why I'm putting a Radium fuel cell in my car. The packaging is so nice, the product is great, everything is certified. I don't have to question the quality because Radium stuff is pretty freaking awesome. The aluminum can I was running had 0 certifications. Like I said earlier, the aluminum work hardens, so a lot of times, just putting one of these in a drift car, you only have so much life out of it before it cracks and leaks. And the foam that they usually come with ends up plugging your fuel filters and your fuel pump because it's just a cheap foam. When you buy a cheap fuel cell, you're going to get cheap components. They're going to break down, cause failures, cause issues. Another problem more specific to like drifting is that the fuel pickup for these is actually back here, and it's kind of like a sump down below. These are like a drag race style fuel cell where it's meant to just have back, you know, the G's force the fuel back. So with a little drop sump like this, it's usually going to have fuel. But when you've got drifting, you know, you're trying to pick up something from that spot right there and the fuel slosh around like crazy. It's just not a good design. Now I have a video where I put an in-tank pump with this setup right here with a Holley Hydromat, and it worked better, but to be honest, it was just kind of a Band-Aid. I've killed dozens of inline pumps over the years, and I've kept redesigning my fuel filtration system and my fuel pickup system, my fuel mounting, and all these different things, and finally, I'm just scrapping it. It just took too long and too much money to figure everything out, and now I'm going with the Radium setup because it's just so much better, and this is what I should have done from the beginning. If I would have bought this from the beginning, I would have saved myself $3,000. Now with the Radium setup, I opted to go with one that has a fuel cell mounting cage, a fuel vapor vent kit, a direct mount fill cap, and I even got a fuel level sender. That's something that I've never had. I've never had a working fuel gauge on my A86 in the 10 years I've owned it. Something else I didn't just want to breeze over is the importance of a fuel vent kit with your fuel cell. Not just with the Radium fuel cell, but any fuel cell. And it really consists of 3 components. The first is a fitting that goes in the vent port on the fuel cell. The next is a nice big long piece of hose that is rated for fuel vapor. And the last bit is a filter that goes in the other end of the hose, and sometimes that's also accompanied by another fitting. The reason why this is important is because fuel does evaporate as it gets hot, right? You're going to have vapor that builds up. And if you don't have a vent like this, it's going to vent inside of the car, fuel fumes build up inside of the car, and then that's where you get explosion or potential explosion problems or fuel fumes that are going to be bad for your health. So having a vent kit like this, the purpose of it is to be able to vent outside of the vehicle so you don't have vapor that builds up in the cabin, and so that way you don't have the fire hazard inside of the car. So there's all kinds of different ways to route this. And I'm going to have another video where I go over all the information about mounting a fuel cell, which includes positioning the fuel cell inside of the car, how to run the fuel vapor vent kit, different considerations for when mounting it, as well as what kind of a structure you should have to mount a fuel cell. This whole kit, everything together, cost about $2,600 bucks. This is 2022 pricing, beginning of the year. So now before somebody gets fired up in the comments, yes, there are other brands that do similar things as Radium. Yes, you can nickel and dime this and save a little bit more by dropping off certain things. You can save some money. You don't have to spend all this much money. You can try and piece the entire kit yourself. You can keep an eye out for used parts and all kinds of other things. But for me, it got to a point where it was just worth it to me to have everything packaged together. So I'm going to plop it in the car and don't have to worry about anything. The only thing that I've had to install on this, because when I ordered it, this was already mounted in the fuel cell. I just had to put the fuel filler on top, and I just have to put the vent kit together, and that's it. And the vent kit is a hose and a couple of fittings. It's great to have everything come assembled. I took this out so you could see it in the video. There's also something to be said for Radium's quality control and build quality. It is top-notch stuff. One of the other things about a fuel cell is you just buy one. You don't need to continue buying them because you build one drift car, say you want to build a different drift car, you can just pull the fuel cell out, put it in the new one. I drive an A86. Will I always drift an A86? I don't know. All I know is that whatever car I get next, I can just pull the fuel cell out and put it in the new car. Now that you understand what a fuel cell is and about the fuel cell I recommend, let's talk about when you need one for your drift car. Most grassroots drifters wouldn't benefit from a fuel cell. Most newer cars, like a 350Z, has some sort of internal baffling in the tank, and it has a surge tank of sorts where it's got like a little cage like that around the fuel pump as a part of the fuel pump sender module assembly, whatever you want to call it. I put that aluminum fuel tank in my car out of necessity more than anything. At the time, My stock tank had 0 baffling because it was meant for a carbureted engine, which also means it had no in-tank pump, and it was pretty crusty. So I swapped in the aluminum fuel cell thinking it was going to save me all this headache of trying to source the better fuel tank from a GTS AE86, but really in hindsight, I should have just bought the dang thing because I spent so much extra money on that trying to get it set up working well. Now, I would start looking into a fuel cell if you're looking at tube in the rear of your car. At that point, you might need to relocate your fuel tank anyway, and so a fuel cell makes sense then. Because fuel cells can be ordered in many different sizes and shapes, it allows you to move it into a different position to get better weight distribution or better crash safety stuff. Another reason to look into a fuel cell is if you are going to compete in drifting above a grassroots level. If that's where you're headed and you're getting ready to graduate from grassroots and go to Pro-Am or go to say like clutch kickers, because now if you're gonna put a fuel cell in your car, they do require one that has a bladder. Having the extra safety is recommended and sometimes required. The more serious the competition, the more potential there is for bad crashes. Having the extra safety features of a proper fuel cell could make the difference if you just happen to, retube the rear end of your car or having your entire car burn to the ground. That's pretty much it. If you're at a grassroots level and you're getting fuel slosh and fuel aeration, then maybe you look into getting just a surge tank. And if your car is still a street car, probably don't look at getting a fuel cell. But if you're going full race car and tubing the rear end of your car or moving on to a higher level of competition, look at a fuel cell. And honestly, the only fuel cell you should look at is a Radium, in my opinion. If you're curious about the fuel cell that I purchased and all the different things, I go into more detail about all the individual components in this video here. So click the link wherever it shows up at and take a look at that. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, share. If you got questions, put them in the comments. I'll get back to you. Thanks.